Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Alt. I'm a partner at Husch Blackwell, located in our Jefferson City, Missouri office. I hope it is as beautiful wherever you find yourself as it is here today. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them via the question box. We'll do our best to answer them during the webcast. If we can't get to them, or if they're a little too specific for what we're talking about, we'll try to answer them by email. A PDF of today's presentation is available in the resources folder, and this program has been approved for legal education hours. So to report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast for watching or sharing. And toward the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. So that's it for housekeeping. Let's get started with the program. As I said, my name is Jordan Alt. I am a litigator by trade, and I also serve as co-chair of Husch Blackwell's nonprofit organizations and religious institutions team. So I spend a good chunk of my day every day working with nonprofit entities and churches of all sizes as they face various legal issues and quite a few non-legal issues as well. You won't have to listen to me for the next hour or so. The good news is I'm joined by two excellent presenters. The first is Jessica Hembree, who is the founder of Platform Civic Strategies. Jessica has extensive experience in the nonprofit sector, including 10 years as policy director for a regional health foundation. Her work at Platform is focused on providing nonprofit and philanthropic organizations with two key services: strategic planning for public policy change and enhanced civic participation, and designing policy advocacy efforts. The last speaker we have is Reverend Nate Berneking, who is the Director of Financial and Administrative Ministries for the Missouri Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, which is quite a title. In this role, Nate offers resources and education for local churches and pastors in Missouri and beyond, including on a host of tax and legal issues. Before becoming a pastor, he was actually a corporate attorney with what was then Husch and Eppenberger in our St. Louis office. And I'm very pleased to be able to work with Nate almost every day to represent United Methodist churches across the state. So what are we going to talk about today? At the outset, I'll get through all the boring-ish legal stuff. We'll talk a little bit about advocacy and the rules that apply to tax-exempt organizations. We'll talk about electioneering and the role of the Johnson Amendment, and then some discussion about where things stand. I know if you are in the St. Louis region, you've probably seen a lot of media coverage about kind of the interplay between local government and nonprofits. And I know the Johnson Amendment was a big focus of the Trump administration. So we'll address both of those issues. I will hand the baton to Jessica, who will talk about how her work and how nonprofits can engage in advocacy work. And then Nate will bat cleanup, talking about special considerations for religious entities. I will say that's not an invitation for those of you who work for non-religious entities to sign off, because number one, he's a great presenter. And number two, what I found is a lot of my nonprofit clients, even if they are not religious by nature, end up partnering with a lot of religious organizations. So having that knowledge should be of assistance to you. Because we are doing this virtual, of course, we need to have some poll questions. The first of this: what is your role in the nonprofit world? You can select executive director, staff member, board member, attorney, or other. I'll give you just a second to complete that. And then we'll see who we have on the webinar today. All right, I see them trickling in now. One more second. This is kind of fun to be on the other end of this. So it looks like we're kind of all across the board: executive directors, staff, board members, and attorneys. So the good news is we have a great group that represents all aspects of the nonprofit sector. So welcome. Regardless of what you clicked, my hope is you'll walk away with some good information today. So first, a note on advocacy. The focus of my section, at least, is really going to be on 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. So I included, this is just a portion of definition of those organizations from the tax code, 26 U.S.C. 501c3. It talks about corporations that are operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, or educational purposes. But I want to focus on that last phrase in bold. This says no substantial part of the activities of which is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. So what does that mean? 501c3 excludes corporations if a substantial part of their activities are intended to carry on propaganda or influence legislation, which means that charitable nonprofits can engage in some legislative lobbying activities and still qualify as a 501c3 tax exempt. The question, of course, is, well, if I can do that, what is an insubstantial part of my activities? What does that look like? And unfortunately, neither the IRS nor Congress has provided a really good concrete definition of that. Really, whether or not your lobbying activities are substantial or insubstantial depends very much on the facts and circumstances of each case. And I will say I'm getting out ahead of Jessica. My guess is she'll be talking all about this in her section. Why is this important? Because if you violate this test, nonprofits can lose their tax-exempt status and possibly pay an excise tax on lobbying expenditures. So how do you determine whether your lobbying activities are substantial? What I often counsel is determine the percentage of your annual expenditures and time devoted to efforts to influence legislation in relation to your total activities. I've been to a number of speakers on this. I've read a number of articles, and there's no magic formula. There's no general number. I see this 15% of total expenditures thrown out sometimes. Again, that is not a silver bullet. So what does that mean for you? If you are a nonprofit entity that rarely engages in any kind of lobbying, maybe you have someone that writes a letter to the editor about something that your organization is passionate about, or you speak at an event or testify in front of a legislative committee, that's probably not going to be an issue. That's probably going to be a very small portion of both your expenditures and your time. What happens if you get more involved? If you are sending out mailers, if you are reaching out to legislators, if you are hosting events, one of the options that you have is what's called taking the 501H election. You fill out IRS form 576H, 8, which gives you an objective expenditure test. You will look at your expenditures for the year and determine the percent of those that are allocated towards lobbying. And the IRS will give you very strict guidance about what you can and can't allocate towards lobbying. So if you are getting into the point where you think, this might be substantial, it's a good step to take. And again, Jessica will probably have some more to say on that. It is, however, not an option for private foundations or for churches. So you may be asking, well, what is the difference between lobbying and electioneering? So lobbying is going to involve carrying on propaganda or influencing legislation. So think of that as ballot measures. In Missouri, for example, a lot of nonprofits were very outspoken about Medicaid expansion. That was a ballot measure. Imagine legislation to expand gambling, or legislation that impacts environmental justice or LGBTQ+ rights. If that is an area that your nonprofit is interested in or advocates for, that's going to be lobbying because you're focused on legislation. Electioneering is different. Electioneering involves work on behalf of or in opposition to a candidate for public office. It can be local, state, federal, or foreign. The individual does not have to have formally announced their candidacy. If your nonprofit, your tax-exempt entity, is working on behalf of or in opposition to any of those candidates, that's going to be electioneering versus lobbying. Which brings us to the Johnson Amendment, which you can actually see in the top left of your screen in very, very small font here. That is the actual Johnson Amendment. So I showed you the tax code 501c3 earlier. There's more. So if you look at the bold phrase at the bottom, that is the Johnson Amendment, and which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements, any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. Again, there's no substantial part test there or substantial expenditures. Where did that come from? Then Senator, future President Lyndon Johnson introduced the amendment to a preliminary draft to this section of the tax code in 1954. The story goes that he was running for re-election to the U.S. Senate. His opponent was receiving extensive financial support from tax-exempt groups. So then Senator Johnson offered the amendment banning tax-exempt charities from intervening in campaigns. And from what I can tell, it was adopted with little fanfare. It was signed into law by President Eisenhower, and it has remained in place even as our tax code has been overhauled. So what does it mean? What does it prohibit? There are a few things that are clearly prohibited under the Johnson Amendment. Number one, contributions to political campaign funds. Your tax exempt can't give money to candidates. Number two, public statements, verbal or written, made on behalf of the organization in favor of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, even if only inferred. And number three, voter education or registration with evidence of bias. So again, there's got to be bias there in favor of or in opposition to a candidate or a group of candidates. Now, certain activities may still be okay. They may not be prohibited by the Johnson Amendment, depending on the facts and circumstances. A few examples: voter education activities. If your tax-exempt organization presents a public forum of candidates or publishes a voter education guide, generally that's going to be okay. The same thing with encouraging people to participate in the electoral process. A voter registration drive, get out the vote drives, all fine, with one caveat. Those activities must be conducted in a non-partisan manner. They cannot be masked candidate advocacy. So for example, if you present a public forum and have candidates to your organization or host an event, that's probably fine as long as it's nonpartisan. If at the end of that you ask the candidates to sign a pledge, that is likely going to be prohibited under the Johnson Amendment as inappropriate electioneering. So generally, the IRS has been fairly rigid and prohibited any activity related to the political process. That has changed a little bit over the years. An example here, this comes from an IRS statement, a compilation of voting records of legislators. That's fine. So if you are making available the voting records of different candidates or of legislators in your state, members of Congress, for example, that in and of itself is going to be allowable under 501c3. However, if you publish that compilation and include editorial comment or approval or disapproval, if you have little green check marks next to certain candidates and red flames rising from others, that's going to be a violation of the Johnson Amendment. That's inappropriate electioneering. And the IRS is going to take a closer and stronger look if that opinionated information is disseminated widely or if it's disseminated on the eve of an election. So generally, what are you going to consider? In the electioneering that you are doing, do you identify a candidate by name or approve or disapprove of their actions? How close is it to an election? And are you referencing that election? What is the issue? Is it a wedge issue? Is it an issue that you have a history of advocacy involving? Is there a non-electoral reason for the timing? And finally, who is your audience? Are you sending this out to a small group, or is this going out to voters in your county or your state? All questions you need to ask because they are questions that the IRS may be asking if your actions are challenged. So again, what I see in my practice is around election time, and we are, I guess, 13 months out from the midterm election. So I guess we're in the campaign season now. I don't know if the campaign season ever ends. I see a lot of my nonprofit clients, even if they are not political by nature, involved in these two steps. They are creating voter guides, including votes on issues that my clients care about. Generally polling candidates about their response to or thoughts on certain issues. That's fine as long as you're not editorializing. Hosting a candidate forum, fine as long as it's nonpartisan. You have a broad range of topics. All candidates are offered equal opportunity. In other words, you can't invite 3 candidates and spend all your time asking softball questions of one candidate while you're grilling the other 2. Candidates can speak at nonprofit events if it's nonpartisan. And again, get out the vote drive. We've seen this more and more where churches, nonprofits are out in the community signing people up to vote, are making vans and drivers available to get people to the polls. All great things. Again, they have to be nonpartisan in who is targeted. You can target your community. You can't go off a voting list and say, well, we're going to go down the list and just pick out Democrats or just pick out Republicans and offer them a ride to the poll. Obviously, that can get you into trouble. What about your employees? If you are a tax-exempt organization, your employees can participate in voter education or get out the vote efforts. It should be on their own time. They shouldn't be using company email or computers or mailing lists to do any kind of electioneering that the nonprofit in and of itself can't do. And this last bullet I've had come up, if an employee runs for office and campaigns on issues related to the nonprofit's mission, consider seeking legal guidance. I have one nonprofit client where I saw an event that the nonprofit posted, and everyone there was wearing shirts advertising the executive director who was running for city council at the time. I got a little green when I saw that. So be careful if you have those kind of issues. It's good to get legal advice. What happens if you violate? Obviously, the worst thing that could happen is your tax-exempt status could be revoked. Most nonprofits thrive because gifts to them are tax deductible. If you don't have that 501c3 tax-exempt status, if that goes away, it could be difficult to raise funds. In very extreme cases, personal liability could be imposed. But in reality, this prohibition is rarely enforced. I will say, I have seen an uptick in individuals reaching out or filing complaints against nonprofits in the last couple of years, in the last couple of election cycles. So this may become more common. The example that's always thrown out was an organization called Branch Ministries. In 1992, on the eve of the presidential election, this ministerial group took out full-page ads in the USA Today and Washington Times against Bill Clinton, again, 4 days before the election. And the IRS stepped in and said, no, say goodbye to your tax-exempt status. What is not prohibited? If you are a nonprofit leader, an executive director, a board member, a volunteer, including religious leaders, you are, of course, free to support or oppose candidates in your personal capacity. If you are speaking at an event, for example, and you are introduced as executive director at such and such, it's probably important for you to state that you are doing just that. And also, nonprofit leaders may speak about political issues on behalf of their organization, short of endorsing or opposing particular candidates. I'm going to finish up very briefly with where things stand, because I have had some nonprofit clients reach out to me. There's been some confusion in this, involving this issue. So numerous politicians have actively and publicly sought to repeal the Johnson Amendment. Some argue that the amendment is a violation of their free speech. Some religious groups say that it violates their free exercise clause. So if you think of it as a boxing match, in this corner, then candidate, later President Donald Trump, who campaigned on getting rid of the horrible Johnson Amendment, who claimed that Lyndon Johnson took away religion's voice and silenced the church, and basically bragged about getting the repeal of the Johnson Amendment into the Republican Party. I love this quote. "I figure that's one way I'm getting to heaven." Also on this side, in that corner, a number of religious leaders, such as Jerry Falwell, have spoken about repealing the amendment. The Alliance Defending Freedom has what's called the Pulpit Freedom Initiative that actually urges ministers to violate the statute in protest. On the other hand, the National Council of Nonprofits they've come out in support of the Johnson Amendment, basically saying it protects tax-exempt 501c3 organizations from the rancor of partisan politics and being harassed by politicians seeking endorsements. And indeed, if you think about that, if your tax-exempt organization could legally endorse a candidate, imagine all the candidates that would be knocking on your door, and imagine the impact that that would have on your fundraising and your programming. In addition, the Joint Committee on Taxation has found that repeal could cost taxpayers upwards of $2 billion a year. Why? Because a lot of payments that are now going to political candidates would instead be tax exempt. They'd be going to 501c3 nonprofits that would then funnel those funds to the candidates. A number of denominations, faith leaders, and nonprofit leaders have also come out in support of the Johnson Amendment. So where do we stand? At the end of the day, the Johnson Amendment survives. There was an uptick in legislation in 2017 and 2018 to repeal the amendment. That all failed. There was a lot of confusion when in 2017, President Trump signed what was called the Executive Order Promoting Free Speech and Religious Liberty. And despite President Trump's boast that the executive order got rid of the Johnson Amendment, the language is still part of the tax code. It is still being enforced. So although there was some confusion in 2017 and 2018, you should know that as things stand today, the Johnson Amendment and the prohibition on electioneering by nonprofits, other than in the ways that we've already talked about, still stand, and you will need to follow them. Before I kick this over, I think we have another poll. What is the estimated percentage of your nonprofit's expenditures and time devoted to political advocacy? I will keep the secret. It's not going to the IRS. But you can choose whether you are strict, 0%, 1 to 5, 6 to 15, 16 to 25, or more than 25%. I'll give you a few more seconds before I pass the baton here. All right. Okay. So generally, with a few exceptions, most of our audience says they are below that 15% threshold, and a number say that they are at 0%. I will say one of the reasons that we've done this is because a lot of nonprofits that have traditionally been at 0% find themselves embroiled in political activities more than they would ever like. Masking, vaccines, we have a lot of discussion with educational clients on critical race theory, all being injected into the process in a way that is, whether they like it or not, political. So even if you're at 0% there, you may find yourself being dragged into political debate, even kicking and screaming. There is one question that popped up that I'd like to address. And the question is, when it comes to fact versus misinformation, do representatives from both perspectives need to be included? That's a good question. So my answer would be, if you are addressing an issue, and the question specifically calls anti-vaccine and anti-mask information, if that is something that you feel strongly about, your organization is involved in, that I would think is going to be more of a legislative issue. Unless you are advocating on behalf of a candidate related to one of those issues, I would think that you can make statements without having to really take a measured approach and give both sides equal airtime. Hopefully that answered your question, but obviously it changes. If you are hosting a public forum, if you are involved in electioneering and you have one candidate that feels one way and another candidate that feels the other way, that's where you're going to have to be careful. When you switch from lobbying to electioneering, and instead of enforcing or arguing against enforcement of mask mandates or vaccines, you're advocating on behalf of a candidate who's doing that. That's where you're going to have to be more careful and take a more nuanced approach. That said, I'm going to pass the baton to Jessica, who will tell you what you can do to engage in advocacy without falling into any of the pitfalls that I've discussed thus far. Jessica?
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you so much. Good, afternoon, everybody. My name is Jessica Hembree. I run a small consulting firm called Platform Civic Strategies. I'm based in the Kansas City area and really focused throughout the Kansas City region and the state of Missouri, state of Kansas, on working exclusively with nonprofit organizations so that they can build up their voice around policy and advocacy. I think when we have conversations like this, it's really easy to see all the kind of danger and risk and complications and pitfalls, but I also want to create some space to lift up the fact that nonprofits can and do serve a really important role in political conversations. A lot of nonprofits are really, really close to the folks they serve. If there's going to be an emerging public health issue, or if there's spikes in hunger or poverty, like nonprofits are oftentimes the first organizations to see that and acknowledge that. And their voices can and are really, really important for lifting up important issues for policymakers. So while I'm glad there are people like Jordan who are worrying about all the things that could go wrong and keeping people on the right page, I'm here to worry about all the things that can go right and all the opportunities that there are when nonprofits do use their voice for good change in the world. So I want to really just focus in on this. I think all these legal questions around what nonprofits can and can't do, and lurking oftentimes below them is a whole set of very practical questions of like, okay, so if we accept that this is something that we are legally allowed to do, then what? How do we decide which issues to take on? How do we minimize risk? How do we talk to our board members about it? How do we even decide what our next steps are as a nonprofit organization? So I'm going to talk through some of those here. The first thing I would encourage everyone to do is just take a brief moment and think about what your actual mission statement is as a nonprofit. A lot of organizations are created to fulfill direct service goals. They're programmatic in nature, and yet when you really look at their mission statement, it might be a poverty alleviation program, and their mission statement is to end hunger. And if you talk to many people in these nonprofits, they'll acknowledge that, what they're doing is good and important and valuable work, but ultimately, I think about hunger in particular. And you can give backpacks full of food to students on a Friday, but if SNAP benefits go away, all the good work you've done as a nonprofit goes away. So there's all these programs and policies and regulations in place that really do contribute to your ability to achieve your mission. So really look at your mission statement and ask yourself what it'll take to deliver on that mission statement. And I think oftentimes we realize that these bigger systems and policies have a lot to do with how likely we are or aren't to deliver on our mission. So I challenge everyone to view this as a realm of opportunity and not just scary stuff. So my kind of pointers about how to do this is first off, always lead with your mission statement. I asked everyone to think about their mission statement for a reason, because ultimately, and this is such a good segue from the question that was asked in the Q&A, was people, I think, to some extent expect nonprofits to live their mission. So if I see a public health nonprofit that's going out there right now talking about vaccines and masking, I'm not surprised by that. That is very, very, very consistent with their mission. Anytime you do anything that you can draw a kind of straight line between, like, I care about this issue because this is my mission, and if I achieve this policy goal, my mission is advanced, that is your armor. No one's going to come at you. They might try to, but ultimately, no one is surprised that the American Heart Association is advocating for smoke-free workplaces, right? No one is surprised that health foundations are supporting Medicaid expansion. In many ways, this is the role and mission of these organizations. So always make sure that if you're taking on any kind of lobbying or political stance, that you can really closely link that stance you're taking to your mission. That's ultimately going to be one of the most protective things for you, both legally and also in terms of just reputational risk and controversy. The second thing I would highlight is it's sort of famous in political science that change only happens when you have both a problem and a solution. I always joke that the nonprofit community is very, very good at identifying problems. And when it comes time to identify solutions, we're a little bit more like, I don't know, it's a problem, do something about it. But coming to policymakers with just a problem and expecting them to fix it is just a fool's errand. I'll provide a good example here. Let's say I'm very, very concerned about educational equity, and I take that issue to my local legislator. They could come up with lots of different solutions to that problem. Some policymakers might say, that's why we need vouchers. We need to get more kids out of public education and into private schools. The next policymaker might say, oh, that's because we have inequitable discipline practices. We should never suspend kids below third grade. The next policymaker might say that's because schools are underfunded. We need to increase property taxes so we can fund schools better. So you can see one problem can have multiple different solutions that come off of it. So the trick is coming not just with the problem, but with a set of identified solutions that you're advocating for, because you don't want to leave up to chance what solutions are going to be developed by policymakers. The third thing I would point out is just all politics are local. We all know this. It's the most famous aphorism about politics. I tend to see a lot of organizations hear, about getting political, and they think about presidential elections or they think about gubernatorial elections. But so much happens in your local community, your own city council, your own school board, your state legislature. So much is happening in your own backyard that really, really matters. So I challenge everyone to look kind of below DC, below state level politics, and see what's happening in your own community, because there is so much opportunity for nonprofits to make a really big difference on local issues, not only because no one's paying as much attention to them in many cases, but also because that's where your relationships are. Local nonprofits tend to be very, very beloved by local politicians, so you have a really direct link to the ear of those policymakers, so use it. And then the last thing I would note is just that patience is a virtue. I know there are a lot of people of the cloth and whatnot here. Patience is a virtue also when it comes to political work. It is incremental by design, policy change. It means when someone has a terrible idea, it takes their idea a long time to come to fruition. And it also means when you have a really, really excellent idea, it's going to take a while to come to fruition. So when you get into this work, knowing that it's going to take time is really, really important. I always joke that the first three, there was maybe 3 years ago, the Missouri legislature passed 3 bills right out of the gate. The first one was about whether you needed a cosmetology license to do hair braiding. The second one was about catfish noodling. And the third one was like $1 billion budget bill. Like, they are doing so many different things. It's so easy for even really good ideas to get just lost in that shuffle. So it takes a lot of persistence to take an issue from kind of an idea, a solution you've identified, and then it's like pushing a rock up a hill to make it happen in many cases. So be prepared for that slow pace of change. The next slide I have is just, I wanted to note that I have some resources. If they're helpful to people, I've made it a real effort to put these out there so that more and more nonprofits can use them. There's a whole bunch of them. Some of them are about what your tax status means for what you can and can't do. Some of what Jordan talked about. Some of them are just about what are 5 things you could do today to just begin going down this path, ripping that little Band-Aid off. And then there's one about sort of scoping out what you're going to put in front of policymakers. There's just a lot on there. I'd invite you to take a look. I think it's really helpful stuff. Here's my contact information before I turn it over to Nate. But if I have any message to leave you with, it's just give it a try. It's a lot. Come on in. The water's nice. It's a lot less scary once you start doing it. Are you going to do this poll, Jordan?
Yeah, let me run through the poll. First of all, Jessica, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. So the poll question, does your nonprofit have a policy in place for activity related to political advocacy? Just looking for whether you have a policy in place. While you answer this, I will answer one of your questions. We got a question that says, are expenditures seeking government financing for a charity's activity political expenditures? And the answer to that, as far as lobbying, the answer to that is no. Nonprofits, Jessica, yell at me if I'm wrong here, but nonprofits are constantly going to be seeking funding from state and local and federal governments. That is not the same as lobbying. So that the money and time that you spend, put into that shouldn't count towards that substantial test. All right, let's see what we've got. Look at that, I'm impressed. Almost 2/3 of you on the line actually have a policy in place for activity related to political advocacy, which I will say is better than some of the nonprofits that I have served on boards with. We've been a little behind on that, but that's good to know. All right, now we will pass the baton again to Reverend Nate Berneking, who is going to talk about how all of the issues that we've discussed thus far impact religious entities. Nate?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. I really appreciate the opportunity. Again, my name is Nate Berneking. I am an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. I am also a licensed attorney, licensed to practice law in the state of Missouri. As Jordan said, I have on my resume a law firm that sounds an awful lot like the one Jordan works for because it was a predecessor to that law firm. So I'm honored to be part of this conversation today. And actually, I think a lot of what I have to offer is going to echo some of what Jessica had to offer, because I think a lot of her principles that she provided for you are going to apply and are going to help religious organizations steer clear of any issues that might come up with respect to the Johnson Amendment, electioneering, lobbying, and things like that. What I thought I would do is actually kind of walk through some common situations that I know come up in religious organizations. They certainly come up in our United Methodist churches. Every single one of these common situations I have advised one of our churches on, or Jordan has advised them. And I am positive it doesn't matter what variety of religious organization you're working with, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Muslim, any host of religions. My guess is because people are people and politics are politics, you're going to face very similar situations. So first of all, a really common one that comes up is a church board wants, a leadership board wants to send out flyers in support of a ballot initiative. This actually was coming up a lot in a variety of different churches when Medicaid expansion was on the ballot in Missouri. I know it came up in other states for the same issue, but it could be any host of ballot initiatives. And so the church board wants to send out the flyers to support the initiative, and members on the other side of that initiative get angry and say that that's a violation of the Johnson Amendment. Well, again, it's a facts and circumstances kind of test, and a lot's going to depend first and foremost on how much the church has been doing with this sort of activity. Remember kind of the 15% rule. Generally, this is going to fall into the category of lobbying. And so you can do a little bit of it, but if you're doing a whole lot of it, you might be walking up against a line. But the other thing it's going to depend on is what the content of that initiative is. That it is possible that a ballot initiative is so focused as to really be identified with a single party or a single candidate. And when that happens, support or opposition to that initiative may actually, it may be electioneering that's really masquerading as lobbying. So that one, I think it's just going to depend. But generally, a church leadership can support a ballot initiative as long as it's within the threshold that we've already talked about. A church member politician wants to have a public forum in the church building. Again, Jordan's already said, public forums are great. But here's what that normally looks like, at least in my experience. It's normally one candidate who, often for a local political office, and they've approached the church wanting a public forum, but really what that means is it's a forum for them to give a speech to an audience. And obviously, if they're the only candidate involved in the public forum, that's not really the same thing. And offering the space to that politician to do a speech is probably going to be considered electioneering and could be a violation of the Johnson Amendment. I'm going to do one more of these and then look through. I see some questions again that I think I can address. And if not, I can sort of push them to the end, and Jordan or Jessica can address the ones that I can't. Third situation I see a lot of is, and this is really common, some of you are voting in churches or synagogues or other kind of religious houses of worship. Church wants to be a polling place or is a polling place. It's done it for years. A member gets upset, says it's a violation of church and state. Here's my experience. Whoever got upset is upset about something else if it's been happening for years. They're upset that people are tracking in the floor, or they're particularly passionate against or in favor, often against something that they think is going to pass in that particular election. And that's why they're really upset about this activity. But no, churches and houses of worship can be polling places. Actually, in my experience, local boards of elections go through an awful lot to make sure that they don't run afoul of any kind of separation of church-state type issues. So let me pause right there and pick up a few questions, because it looked like several came through here just since I've started speaking. Let's see. Yeah, so first of all, somebody's asked the question, they'd like to encourage community and partner organizations to support voter engagement, and they would like to specifically encourage constituents or partner constituents to vote for candidates that support Medicaid expansion in Kansas. Can we do the second? If so, can we do both activities together? I think this is a great illustration. And I would really kind of leave this more to Jordan and Jessica, but I think you're going to be walking a line there that you may be stepping right over it into a violation of the Johnson Amendment. If you're picking out particular candidates that support Medicaid expansion and encouraging voters to vote for them, I think that is a violation of the Johnson Amendment. Jordan, do you want to correct me if I'm wrong on that?
I would agree with that, specifically if you are calling out a specific candidate or a specific party. Generally, what you're saying in the first part of the question is fine. If you are putting out signs or handing out flyers encouraging people to support Medicaid expansion, that's fine. Taking the extra step and saying, and therefore you should vote for this person or that person, that's where you're going to get into trouble.
I would add on this one, Jordan, I think a lot of nonprofits can get really creative here too. And it's one thing to say vote for X politician because they support Medicaid expansion. It's another thing to say make Medicaid expansion or ask your candidates where they stand on Medicaid expansion or be a Medicaid expansion voter or, you know, kind of asking, not exactly saying where the candidates stand, but inviting members of the public to make that an issue that they're prioritizing when they vote. And I think those are different things in terms of how the IRS would feel about them.
I think that's absolutely right, Jess. Religious organizations specifically have been doing that on a host of issues for a very long time, right? Calling out issues and essentially I think the person followed up with a question that you just answered is essentially making it a bit of a litmus test for the candidates that you want to support. As long as you're focused on the issue and as long as you're, you know, staying in the realm of lobbying, you can absolutely do that. Another question, the question is, what is the 15% rule? So just to review what Jordan said at the outset, so there are two kinds of activities that are touched upon in Section 501c3 of the tax code. One is lobbying, and the tax code is clear. No substantial part of your activities can go towards influencing legislation. The other is electioneering, which says you're not allowed to support or oppose, you're not allowed to essentially work on elections of specific candidates. That's electioneering. Electioneering is prohibited. You can't do it at all. But lobbying, where you're advocating for an issue or a ballot measure, that is allowable. But you still are not allowed to have any substantial part of your assets being used to do those activities. Well, the definition of substantial is not provided by the IRS, by the courts. It's not anywhere to be found. As a safe harbor, and I've even heard staff at the IRS use this same rule, as a safe harbor, lawyers and government folks tend to talk about, well, keep it below 15%. So 15% or less of your assets and activities are focused on lobbying, you're probably safe. If you're over that, you might be walking a line and inviting IRS input. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, about when the IRS does get involved. Just a couple of more common situations that we see. Church wants to organize its community to drive people to the polls, especially the elderly. Again, get out the vote campaigns are absolutely fine. But if you are focusing on getting people out that you know or you think are going to vote for one candidate or another, and you're making that kind of explicit, you might, and especially if you're like doing some electioneering on the bus, you might be asking for trouble when it comes to the prohibition on electioneering. But generally, churches and houses of worship have long participated in get out the vote campaigns and driving folks to the polls. Civic engagement is generally a fine type of activity. This one is near and dear to my heart because I've been asked to do this before and have done it before. A pastor is asked to testify at a state legislative hearing on an upcoming bill. Again, if it's a bill in Congress, it's probably going to fall into lobbying. As long as you're below the 15% rule, you're going to be fine. But again, if it's strongly identified with one particular candidate, you might be at risk. One thing you can do, as Jordan said at the outset, you can testify in your capacity as an individual all you want. You just have to be clear and put it on the record in the hearing that you're there as an individual, not on behalf of your particular organization. And then finally, a pastor is asked to write an opinion piece for the local paper. Actually, I always get this when it's already been done. The pastor has written the opinion piece in the paper and somebody is upset about the opinion the pastor holds. A couple of things to remember. One, you can write an opinion piece in your individual capacity, but you probably need to state that in the piece that you're writing in your capacity as an individual and not as the pastor or the leader of a particular organization. Another thing that you're going to want to avoid is essentially making the opinion piece look like it's some kind of litmus test to be part of your religious organization. So if you were sort of going so strongly in favor of something that you're essentially precluding others from participating, that, especially if it's identified with a candidate, you may be running afoul of the Johnson Amendment. Some considerations to think about. I call them pastoral issues. If you're not in another religious tradition other than Christianity, you might refer to them differently. Honestly, I think all major religions sort of advocate for the care of people and the care of the members of their particular organization. That's kind of what organized religion is all about, right? Care for other people and connecting those people to however we understand transcendence. We care about people. Well, sometimes those pastoral or those issues of care, they might push us towards social involvement. And I think Jessica made really good points about that. And there are items that I think, if from a Christian perspective, we as Christians need to be passionate about because we care for people. On the other hand, that also might push you towards a more measured approach. The truth of the matter is, especially in a religious tradition as kind of large and diverse as the United Methodist Church, where I work, we have people on all sides of a variety of issues. And I thought Jessica said it really well, how problems can present a host of different solutions. We may agree on the problem, but disagree really vigorously on what those solutions might be. And because of that, you may need to think about taking a measured approach in your community, in your congregation or your house of worship. I always caution our pastors in the United Methodist Church that it may be okay for you to write an opinion piece in the local paper in your capacity as an individual, but your folks are going to read that, as are people in the outside community, and that may push you to a more measured approach. I think this one's big. Beware of masking electioneering behind religious talk. And I think this takes a lot of different forms. There's the obvious one, right? Taking on moral imperatives that are just identified with one candidate or one political party. And I'll show you an organization that the IRS thought went afoul of that in just a minute. But then there's also, we have members of Congress that are members of our churches, and they want support, which is what they do as members of Congress, right? Well, we just want to support Congresswoman fill in the blank. They're a lifelong member of this house of worship. Oh, I get it. And you want to be supportive of your members, but that might well put you into the camp of electioneering. And I think you need to be very careful of that. Just a couple more. Actually, just really one more. Bear in mind the sensitivity to religion in our culture as Americans. And that's even within the IRS. Again, that kind of goes back to the pastoral concern I have. It means in engaging in certain activities or engaging in certain kinds of talk can really create conflict in your religious organization or from the outside with respect to your religious organization. Religion is a hot button type of practice and issue, and we need to be cognizant of that. It also means the IRS, I would describe it as pretty fragile when it comes to enforcement of the Johnson Amendment. Jordan said it before, hasn't been enforced that much. And I think the reason for that is pretty clear, and that is, if the IRS comes down hard and enforces the Johnson Amendment in one setting or another, it's going to draw the ire of a lot of different people. And in fact, I want to at least elevate you can look this up, elevate a particular case. There's an organization called Christians Engaged. And I'm not making any statement as to whether to support or not support Christians Engaged, but I want to raise it to your attention because in May of 2021, Christians Engaged, they had applied for 501c3 status. And I'm just going to read to you, I'm going to pull their website up and read to you kind of their mission. It says, Christians Engaged exists to awaken, motivate, educate, and empower ordinary believers in Jesus Christ to pray for our nation and elected officials, vote in every election to impact our culture, and engage our hearts in some form of political education or activism for the furtherance of our nation. So Christians Engaged applied for 501c3 status with that particular mission in mind, and the IRS denied them tax-exempt status in May. And the outrage that resulted from that led the IRS in June to reverse course and grant tax-exempt status. And I think it's pretty interesting. And I don't want to give any sort of affirmation or disaffirmation of Christians Engaged, but if you look at Christians Engaged website, you can see why maybe the IRS had questions. They have members of Congress and state legislators on their board, and they are all of one single party. They have a conference coming up, and the speakers are of one single party. They identify particular issues that would push them in the direction of one single party. But because it's in this realm of religious organization, and because the IRS has been so loath to enforce the Johnson Amendment, all it took was when they were denied tax-exempt status was for several members of Congress to begin signing letters and for it to appear in the media, and the IRS turned tail and reversed course. I don't know where that would have ended up if they hadn't done that, but you see how fragile really the IRS is and how hot religion can be as when it's the context for in talking about the Johnson Amendment or lobbying. So I'm going to stop there, and there are a couple more questions. Let's see if these are more for me or for Jordan and Jessica.
Nate, I've actually been looking through them and can tackle.
These are more Jordan than me. Maybe Jessica.
I was going to say I've looked through a couple and can tackle, and then Nate and Jessica, if you want to weigh in and tell me why I'm wrong, I'd love to hear it. A couple questions we got. First, what are the rules for writing recommendation letters for judicial candidates? I don't see any problems there. If you, as a director, as a board member, as a volunteer, are asked to write a letter of recommendation, not a problem at all. Again, you'll want to be doing that in your own personal capacity. You're not going to say nonprofit X supports this judicial candidate. And if it is an elected position, you don't want to put a sign with their name outside of your building. But generally, writing the letter of recommendation should be fine. Someone asked when a 501c3 organization is in obvious violation of IRS rules, to what extent is the board or leadership personally liable to the IRS? I think that would be extraordinarily rare for a director to be personally liable to the IRS. I just don't think it will happen, absent some amount of fraud. If members of the board are asleep at the wheel, that may be one thing. However, the IRS is very clear that a large majority of tax fraud that goes on involves tax-exempt organizations. So if there is an argument that members of the board or leadership are somehow knowledgeable of that fraud and turning the other way, or worse, involved in that fraud, then you may have an issue. Absent that, I think it would be fairly rare. Obviously, I don't represent the IRS, though, so don't take that to the bank. And the last question we have is, do you have examples of policies for political advocacy for nonprofits, especially from churches? I will say I do not, partly because nonprofits are all over the map, and what they want to do in the political sphere is all over the map. So it's difficult to have kind of an example or template of a policy as to what is allowed or what is not allowed. Jessica or Nate, any additions to those answers?
I was going to make just a couple little notes around the question of sort of IRS and liability for obvious violations. And Jordan, you briefly touched on this at the very beginning, but I think it's important for people to know that a lot of the process from the IRS perspective is very complaint driven. So I've had people sort of ask me questions of like, what if I go to a meeting and someone else goes to the meeting and I feel like the meeting was lobbying and the other person feels that it wasn't lobbying? Will the IRS notice that? And I cannot conceive of a scenario where the IRS is going to be looking at people's calendars or anything like that. There is not that level of attentiveness to all of this on the part of the IRS. That's not to say they're not watching. Always do what's right, but broadly, these issues come up when they are complaint driven. So I always say you should know who your opposition might be on an issue. I've done a lot of work around tobacco, and the tobacco companies are never afraid to, they'll ask for every document. They'll try to catch you in any little mishap. So I'm incredibly diligent on my record keeping all the time, but especially when I know I'm working on a tobacco issue where they're going to try to catch me up on it. But it is all very complaint driven. The only other thing I was going to briefly note is there was this question about the sort of 15% and the insubstantial part test according to the IRS. And especially for smaller nonprofits that might want to do more of this work and that might like the certainty of more clarity, the IRS does have an option called the 501H election. It's a very simple form that you can fill out. And in that case, you just plug in essentially what your annual revenue is, and it tells you exactly how much money you can spend on lobbying activities. So there is a much more kind of bright line, clear test for organizations that want to do more of this work. And I would highly recommend giving the 501H election a look.
Just to piggyback on what Jessica says, I could not agree more with what you just said, Jessica. One thing for everybody who's watching today from a religious organization, 501H is not an option for you. Sorry, houses of worship are not going to qualify. I also want to, Jessica's 100% right. The IRS is complaint driven. I do think churches and other houses of worship need to be aware, especially now that in a post-COVID world, things you say in worship are suddenly a lot more widespread than they once were. No, the IRS is never going to have any idea if some small congregation somewhere has a conversation that might otherwise violate the Johnson Amendment. But if you're putting stuff out on the internet, the IRS might not be watching, but somebody who doesn't like it could be. And that's where the nature of a complaint could come up. And the other thing I'd say is, where do complaints come in the church world? Usually from within the same church, because somebody has gotten upset with something that's been said or done.
All very good points. Thank you both. That ends things for us. First of all, on behalf of Nate and Jessica and everyone from the Husch Blackwell nonprofit team, thank you for joining us. We hope the information was helpful to you and your organization. I will say a few matters. First of all, I saw a number of people on the attendees list from organizations that are doing great work in Missouri, Kansas, beyond. So thank you for joining. This program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. Tomorrow, you will get a certificate of attendance that includes the course numbers, as well as a recording of the webcast that you can watch or share. And please do share. And finally, of course, it's a webinar. You'll get a survey. We use your feedback to plan future programs, so please take a few minutes to complete that survey. Thank you so much for joining us today and for all that you are doing. This concludes our webinar. Take care.